Good morning, guys. It's Dr. Murphy. Today's date is the 14th of April, 2021. And I am here today to tell you about how I have had the worst day ever. That's right. Fears, concerns, all laid bare yesterday and revealed, reminding us that fear should not paralyze us. Fear should not paralyze us. That's right. I got the J&J vaccine and I have had a headache today on Murphy's Medical Minute. J&J, headaches, brain surgery, and death. Clot problem, bigger problem. All right, guys, let's get to it, shall we? Let's get to it, shall we? Today's date is the 14th of April, 2021, 4/14/2021. Today's topic is COVID-19 and vaccines. Do we have a J&J problem? J&J, for those who don't know, is Johnson & Johnson. That's right. So this podcast today is for those who were vaccinated with Johnson & Johnson. Those who were vaccinated with Johnson & Johnson. Yesterday, literally, all hell broke loose. Why? Because I recommended the Johnson & Johnson vaccine to many of my patients because of several things that we'll go over in this talk today. The CDC yesterday and FDA said, hey, we should pause vaccinating with Johnson & Johnson. We're going to review the risks and why they said that they did that. We're going to talk about the benefits of the Johnson & Johnson Janssen vaccine, which were some of the obvious benefits and the reasons why I decided to go with this vaccine. After that, we'll talk about what the heck we're going to do if you had the COVID-19 vaccine. I don't know if you can see it on the podcast, but I got a little bandage here from some blood work that I had. And we'll talk about what you need to do after getting the Johnson & Johnson vaccine. And lastly, I want to talk about the future of vaccination, the future of returning back to normalcy, and how vaccine by itself is not the key to normalcy. Not the key to normalcy. J&J had been having some bad press for a couple of weeks, right? I mean, they had some issues with the plant in Baltimore, which fumbled up J&J and AstraZeneca vaccines. Upon further digging, it appears all of the J&J vaccine, or the majority of it, that we had been vaccinating with in the United States was manufactured in Europe, in the Janssen factories. Unfortunately, in the United States, Baltimore was manufacturing, a factory in Baltimore was manufacturing AstraZeneca and Johnson & Johnson, and there was a quote-unquote mix-up resulting in the destruction of 15 million doses of J&J. Some of the bad press previously, a couple of sites had closed down. If you look at here at one of the sites at Dick's Sporting Goods Park, we had what appears to be a vasovagal syndrome. People were dizzy, nausea after the vaccine. There were 11 out of 1,700 people that had vasovagal syndrome. I'm here to tell you right now, in the blood draws that we did on our patients and the patients that we saw for COVID-19, we had vasovagal syndrome, and probably at a rate that was equal to or maybe even a little bit higher than what we saw with the Johnson & Johnson vaccine. So when that happened, everyone came to me and said, is this still the one you want to get? Are you sure this is the one you want to get? I said, it was the one that I got. It was the one that I received. Then the hammer. If you are on Drudge Report, you are in for some bad news. Yesterday, the hammer was the CDC and the FDA saying, please pause your program. And what seemed to be a whoops, sorry, lost 15 million doses, may have ended up to be a much bigger problem. Much, much bigger problem. And I can tell you right now with myself, when I read the reports, I was concerned. Why? Because I had the J&J vaccine. I got it in Chelsea in New York City because we didn't have it in Connecticut. And despite me searching everywhere for it, I couldn't find it. And so I went down to New York City and received the vaccination in Chelsea. People said, Doc, why did you wait? Why didn't you do Moderna and why didn't you do Pfizer? There's a whole host of reasons for that a lot of people can go into. But frankly, Moderna had way too high an mRNA dose. I didn't like that. In addition, I didn't like the novel lipid particle technology. I was worried about autoimmunity with that particle technology. Also, I can tell you right now that the J&J has been studied with the South African variant, and we know that it is a proxy, and it was effective with the South African variant. It wasn't as effective as the wild type variant, but with the E484K mutation, I knew I had some protection. In addition to that, the New York City variant was growing in New York City. It was growing in New York City. And because of that, I knew we would have a B.1.526 problem in the state of Connecticut. It's coming. It's just a matter of time. In addition to that, this was a single shot protection. Single shot. I didn't have to go back in. I remember getting the hepatitis vaccines. It was 3 shots and it was over months. This was single shot protection with a medium, with a mechanism that's known to exist in nature. This was a viral infection with a modified adenovector virus. So you're basically getting infected with adenovirus. And so this is a known mechanism. And so I felt more comfortable with that. In addition, they had been using these mechanisms for HIV research for over a decade. You have data back in 2009 trying to create an HIV vaccine using adenovector methods. So this was not new. This was not new. This was studied. In addition, it had been used in the vaccine for Ebola. So I felt very comfortable with this mechanism. Now, that being said, I hate being a cheerleader. I hate being a cheerleader because you get this thing called anchoring bias. And anchoring bias means that you anchor your decision as the best decision. And if it was the first decision, you anchor that as well. So you have decision bias, you have anchoring bias, and just a lot of cognitive biases going on when you're a cheerleader. But I believe that this vaccine was key to helping the underserved. I believe this vaccine was key to helping the underserved. There's no doubt about that. It was absolutely the key to the underserved. And because of this, I believed, and I still believe in the J&J vaccine. I believe that it's probably having some coverage for B.1.526 and 1.525. And the question about the California variant, who knows? But we know that E484K was covered with the South African variant here. My concern really was the concern of the manufacturing errors. It was a concern of the manufacturing errors. You know, this is a slide from Dr. Topol. I like Eric. I think he does a great job. And he identifies the J&J efficacy with P1 at 68%. Now, technically, P1 wasn't the dominant strain at that time. P2 was. The Manaus variant was the P1 variant, and that's how you can keep it different from Rio and the P2 that was studied in Rio with J&J. So the P1 actually is closer with its mutations to the South African variant. And do we have data on the South African variant? You bet. We do. We have J&J data on the South African variant. And therefore, I picked J&J. I knew AZ didn't cover the B.1.351 and it had the clot risk. I know Novavax had some reduced effectiveness with the B.1.351 as well. Similar though to the J&J, but we couldn't get Novavax here in the United States. J&J had reduced effectiveness with the South African variant as well. Moderna doesn't really appear to have very good effect with South African variant or P1 from the neutralization studies at all. And the same is true with Pfizer. So we are in a rock and a hard place, and really, frankly, I believe that's why I thought the J&J was the best choice. Pfizer, we're still waiting on coverage for P1, even though there's a little study out of Grossman that said B.1.526 and Pfizer work. We know that B.1.351 is not effective with a single dose of Pfizer, and so there's some concern about that as well. Moderna, listen, we've got data on it. We know that the Moderna mRNA dose is high. We know about the Moderna arm, and people get really sick with it. I didn't have the time to be put down even a day. And so I chose against Moderna that way. I also had read the studies on the supraphysiologic doses inducing things like prion disease with mRNA. I don't know whether that's real or not, but there's some theoretical concerns there. And so again, that's why I picked J&J. AstraZeneca is not even available in the United States. And the coverage for the Brazilian variant, we don't have data on. We don't have effective coverage on the South African variant with AZ. They shut the study down. Cerebrovenous sinus thromboses are real. EMA reviewed it, and they said carry on, despite the clear link. Enter an additional adenoviral vector, the J&J. So the cerebrovenous sinus thromboses, these clots, right? So a clot in the brain is bad. You usually need brain surgery if it bleeds. And so with the J&J, there were 6 of these cases identified in women out of 6.8 million studied so far. But I'm here to tell you right now, there are going to be more cases. We have to be honest, there are going to be more cases. These are vaccines, they stimulate the immune system, they do a lot of different things. And what we need to remember is the spike protein does a lot of stuff. Making the spike protein in your body, if you tend to be an avid producer of it, you're going to have a lot of spike protein. And we know that that protein is not just an entry protein. It also appears to be a signaling protein. There's biologic effect. Very similar in Marfan's disease. We used to think Marfan's disease was just a disease of a structural protein called fibrillin. But what we found out is actually structural proteins in the elegant design of human beings often have additional functions. And with fibrillin, we've got a whole signaling pathway with transforming growth factor beta. An entire pathway. So therefore, one would safely assume that a protein like spike is probably going to do more than just be the key to enter the cell. And it is. So if you get infected or you get a bunch of mRNA and you make a bunch of spike protein, it's going to act in your body, not just on your immune system. We know that there's endothelial disruption, there's hormonal things, there's a whole host of disruption that happens with the spike protein itself. And so it would be foolish to think there wouldn't be side effects from these vaccines. It would be foolish. And so therefore, 6 out of 6.8 million, I frankly believe that we're probably going to get down to 1 in 500,000 will have some sort of very dangerous reaction. We know with Moderna, they had an anaphylaxis, they had Bell's palsy. With Pfizer, they had Bell's palsy and also case reports of thrombocytopenia, which is precisely the problem that we see with these cerebrovenous sinus thromboses. And when people say, oh, it's only 6 cases, well, I tell you what, if I was one of the 6 cases, I'd be concerned. And I was concerned. And I was very concerned. I had headaches a week after this vaccine. And the headaches had persisted for days. And I even thought maybe I had COVID. I tested myself for COVID. I didn't have COVID. But I had headaches. I couldn't figure out why. And in fact, this had me concerned. So when you look at the AstraZeneca data and you want to just try and blow off the people, I think as clinicians, we have to think through it. So I'm going to present a couple of cases from the AstraZeneca vaccines. The first one's a 37-year-old female who had headaches 1 week after the AstraZeneca vaccine. Came to the ER with persistent headaches and fever. Persistent headaches and fever showed low platelet counts and a brain bleed. On day 1, she had brain surgery. On day 2, she died. The side effects here are rare, but if they are rare and deadly, that's very concerning. Second patient, 42-year-old female, headaches 1 week after vaccination. No fevers. Headaches 1 week after vaccination. And most importantly, she had 14,000 platelet count. So that's a platelet count of 14. Now let me tell you something. In medicine, when we train with low platelet counts, the hematologist says, get concerned when they're 20,000 or less because you can have spontaneous bleeding. Above that, you usually don't see spontaneous bleeding. So when approaching any patient, the first thing you need to do is check your own pulse. This patient, 14,000. Well, guess what? Another brain surgery. That's right, hemicraniectomy was performed. Brain surgery to reduce the pressure in the brain. So what happens is bleeding in the brain causes an increase in pressure because it's a closed space, right? My head can't swell like a Simpsons episode, right? With Mr. Burns tonic that he gives to Ken Griffey Jr. and these guys get big heads, which is all a joke for growth hormone, by the way. Our heads can't swell. So the pressure inside swells. It then pushes our brain down into our brainstem, and our brainstem gets squeezed and we die. So it's a life-threatening condition. So this patient had 14 days in the ICU. And on day 15 from the ICU, she died. Died. Next case. Just if you're thinking it only happens in women, you're wrong. In this case, it's a 32-year-old male. 7 days after vaccination, he complained of backache. Backache, family. Backache. No clinical signs of bleeding. None. 0 clinical signs of bleeding whatsoever. None. No bleeding, backache, portal vein thrombosis. Stuck in the hospital, received steroids and IVIG, which is the treatment here for these sorts of autoimmune attacking of your thrombosis, of your platelets. Steroids and IVIG. An anticoagulant was given to the patient. The patient's going to have to be on it for the next 3 to 6 months. It could be even longer, depending on the treatment strategy. Again, a rare but dangerous side effect. Lastly, I present a case that really concerns me. This was a 39-year-old woman who presented to the ER with abdominal pain and a headache 8 days after vaccination. 8 days after vaccination with the AstraZeneca vaccine. Went to the ER, they did an ultrasound. Not a CT scan, they did an ultrasound. The ultrasound looked normal, meaning, oh no, you don't have pancreatitis. Okay, so we have to include in the differential diagnosis after the J&J vaccine thrombosis. Now in this case, it's terrifying because the patient had a massive cerebral venous thrombosis. Massive thrombosis with abdominal pain. So thrombosis is a clot. There was a massive brain clot that this patient had. And bleeding in the brain with a stroke. Bleeding in the brain with a stroke, again, steroids and IVIG. But here's where it gets concerning. Here's where it gets concerning as a clinician. The platelets were 70,000. Remember when I said that platelets under 20,000 are cause for concern. But we're also taught platelets at, 100,000, 70,000. You repeat those in a couple of weeks. You repeat those in a couple of weeks. You tell the patient to watch for bleeding, and you see if it's real or not. Well, guess what? If you blew this patient off or did an ultrasound and found it to be normal in the ER, and you discharge them, this patient could have died at home from a massive bleed. This patient was lucky. She returned back to the ER 2 days later. With a lot of the private practices being closed and a lot of the doctors not able to see patients in real life and having to do telemedicine, it's really difficult. This patient is a very difficult patient, I think, to handle. It's a very difficult patient to handle. But luckily, anticoagulation, steroids, and IVIG helped this patient out. The massive expense of this care I can't even begin to contemplate. with the AstraZeneca vaccine. So here's the question. Can we expect the same effect from the Johnson & Johnson vaccine? Right now we know that 6 out of 6.8 million vaccines resulted in a cerebrovenous sinus thrombosis, otherwise known as a cavernous venous sinus thrombosis. It's the other name for it, cavernous, because it's a cavern. Well, if we look at the other risks that occur in the general population, we see between 3 to 15 cases of these per million people per year. 15 per million is a lot more. So multiply that by 6. We'll call that 6 million. And now you've got 90 per 6 million rather than 6 per 6 million. We know that pregnant women have an increased risk of this, very significant. It's why we don't mess around when they have headaches. It's why we don't mess around when they have headaches. We also know that it happens in COVID-19. If you want to see something really cause clots, watch COVID-19. And part of that, like I said before, is the spike protein. The spike protein messes with the body and creates clots. You know what else creates clots? Oral contraceptive pills. Oral contraceptive pills, and if you smoke and you have oral contraceptive pills and you have a headache, I'm getting concerned that you have a clot in your brain. And for reference, the odds of getting struck by lightning is around 1 in half a million. 1 in half a million. And I think that's probably what the number is going to be when we take a look at here at the Johnson & Johnson vaccine. Great. Thanks, Doc. You gave me a vaccine that's going to cause me to need brain surgery and die in the ICU. No, I just told you the data on it and the likelihood of it. If I had to do it again today, I'd still choose the Johnson & Johnson vaccine. You're darn right I would. I'd still choose the Johnson & Johnson vaccine. And because of that, I have to ask myself, what should I do for these patients who had the vaccine? I'm going to tell you right now. I think all patients who had the vaccine, especially those patients that had the vaccine in the last, 1 to 2 weeks, especially, you can see these guys day 7, day 8. So something is brewing on day 3 to day 5. So I would say that if you got the vaccine and it's been, 5 to 7 days out or later in the first 3 weeks, you should get a blood count. Even if you're asymptomatic, it doesn't hurt. Just get a blood count, right? I mean, that's what I got here. I went and got my blood work done. If you have symptoms, you have to talk to your doctor right away. If you have headaches, you should be checked out. If you have abdominal pain, fevers, I just presented some cases here. You should be checked out. If you have leg pain, you should be checked out. In our offices, we do ultrasounds of patients' legs that complain of leg pain. Could it be that there's some vascular issue going on? Well, we check it out. But the most important thing here to do is to not freak out. Patients need to be proactive here. They need to not freak out. Keep a symptom log. But do not try to do self-treatment. The problem with this disease is it's a clot plus a bleeding problem. So if you were going to try and do self-treatment with the over-the-counter aspirin or other blood thinners, take your buddy's blood thinner, or vitamins like fish oil or St. John's wort, hoping that you'll thin your blood out, do not do this. Do not do self-treatment with this. Go get your doctor, go get a CBC. If you can't get a CBC, reach out to us at Corona Test CT. We will gladly evaluate you and order a CBC. In addition to that, there are lots of states where you can go order a CBC on your own. Patients need to be proactive here. The risk is low and the cost of a CBC are low, but the cost of death is high. It's high. So you can see here my blood work, my Band-Aid. Here are my platelets. The most important thing with this count that I wanted to know are the platelets. You can look at my other blood counts. You can look from March of 2014 to 2016 to 2020 to 2021. My white count's up a little bit. Well, that's because I'm making spike proteins and I'm fighting it off. My blood counts have stayed the same. My hemoglobin has been relatively stable. My MCV has been pretty stable. And my platelets have been remarkably stable. There's a little drop, but again, remember, it didn't go down under 200 very far. And my platelets now sit at 280. So the likelihood of this being, my headaches being related to this vaccine causing a clot in my brain, are next to non-existent. And guess what happened? I got these results and my headache went away. I think it's a lot cheaper than running to the ER for the full evaluation. I think just getting a blood count is probably an efficient way to do a quick screen of everyone who's got headaches after the J&J vaccine. And I think it's a worthwhile thing to do. So, now that we've gotten one of the 3 legs of vaccination strategy pulled out from underneath us, when are we going to get out of this mess? When are we going to find a way out? How are we going to find a way out? Well, I'm going to tell you right now, again, how we find a way out. We need a medication that prophylaxes infection. Who love it or hate it, there's data on ivermectin. There's a lot of people talking about ivermectin. It's not approved here in the United States by the FDA in any way whatsoever. People are using it off-label. The Frontline Critical Care Coalition advocates ivermectin. There's ivermectin data for prophylaxis. There's ivermectin data for treatment. We need an effective abortive medication. Regeneron is working on their polyclonal antibody as a sub-Q injection, in both prophylaxis and in treatment. There are a lot of other medications, none of them are fully abortive. We will see where the data pans out on polyclonal antibodies. Here in the tri-state area with E484K in the B.1.526 variant, we have to think about using a polyclonal cocktail from Regeneron rather than the bamlanivimab from Eli Lilly. We need better diagnostics to diagnose long COVID. Insight is a lab. I know Dr. Yo and their team are working really hard on being able to diagnose and prognose long COVID, and that'll lead to a proper treatment for long COVID. And I think that's very important. With the FDA pausing the J&J vaccination, I think we have to be honest with ourselves. Most people are not going to take vaccination without a full FDA approval. A whole lot of people are not going to do it without full FDA approval. It's not going to happen. It is not going to happen. And so we need that. The FDA needs to put a full official seal of approval on a vaccination. They got to do it. Otherwise, we're going to have this hesitancy and it's going to continue. In addition to that, we need to have proper reopening. I know everyone's rushing to reopen, and I think the best way that we're going to reopen is by finding a way to do event testing on site. Major League Baseball in Yankee Stadium, you need an antigen test within 6 hours. So roll the antigen testing into events. Just roll it in and get it done. Get it started and get on with it. There's no reason not to do that. I just had a talk with one of our corporate partners, and we talked about opening up their building safely. The last key to opening up safely is tracking ventilation, finding super spreaders, diagnosing them, and getting them out of a building as quick as you can. We got to do this. Patients are exhausted. Patients don't trust the government or the politicians right now. And I can see why. The policies of different governments are all over the place. I think, Ned Lamont's doing the best he can. Governor Lamont's doing the best he can. Governor Cuomo is doing the best that he can, and Governor Murphy as well. But I think it's very confusing what's going on. And I think the people that are giving them advice have their own interests at heart. And so we have to take the advice appropriately. We have to watch and find out what's going on. And we need to remember, not all smoke is fire. Sometimes it's just smoke. And the best person in the best position in the most trusted scenario for vaccination, for reopening, and for everything else, health related, is your family physician. Everyone that I know has a family physician that they trust, and a lot of these physicians have been taken out of the equation. They've been just lifted right out of the equation. They got lifted out of the vaccine equation, so therefore, they're not giving vaccines. I can tell you right now, we're not giving vaccines. We've been trying to give vaccines for over a month. We even bought a thousands of dollar freezer to hold vaccines. But these things sit there empty. They sit there empty. Why? Because we wanted to use massive distributors. While that's great in the numbers of vaccinations we were able to do, the massive distributors are not a warm, comforting voice like Dr. Alan Falkoff in Stanford or Dr. Marcus Mayes in Greenwich. People turn to their primary care physician for guidance and advice. And by taking them out of the equation, you have removed a key linchpin for successful vaccine strategy. I'm here to tell you right now, and all of my patients, as their primary care physician, the Johnson & Johnson side effects are not cause for alarm. We need to keep our cool. We need to be quick-witted and brave. If you have symptoms, you need medical care right away. You need to get checked out right away. If you had the Johnson & Johnson vaccine, you need a CBC right away. Cutting out the primary care doctors was ill-advised, and whoever gave that guidance is now ruining the day, especially with the Johnson & Johnson vaccine. Primary care physicians are the linchpin to getting out of this morass. We need to give them the tools to do the job, to take care of the patients, and get out of this pandemic. And that's my final word on it. So, as you can tell, I was very concerned. I couldn't afford to go down. I've got kids. I've got family. I've got my Murphy Medical Associates family. We got to take care of all of these people. And systematically putting me out of the game jeopardizes so many other lives. It was a risk I couldn't afford to take. So I went and I got my blood count, and I'm feeling a lot better. Just by knowing that my platelets are good and my headache is just allergies. And I think it's so important that everyone else be able to have that same access and that same reassurance. Who gives people that reassurance? Who's always been there to give reassurance to families in distress and in need? Primary care physicians. This whole pandemic sidelined primary care physicians. That's the problem. We've got to fix it. There's no other way. There's no other way. Primary care physicians help us to help ourselves. They teach us how to be well. They teach us how to eat better. They teach us how to avoid problems. They teach us how to wear our seatbelts and wear our helmets when skiing and not to text and drive. They give us preventative care that is essential to keep us safe and healthy, because our bodies are made to be well if we treat them right. And the primary care physician gives us the keys to the car. Gives us the keys to the car. Again, this is Dr. Murphy Medical Associates. Today's date is April 14th, 2021. It's time to rip off the Band-Aid. Rip off that Band-Aid and get back at it. That's right. J&J is paused. Don't freak out. Get a CBC. I still believe in the vaccine, and I believe in vaccinations appropriately used for the right populations, but it's not the way out. Primary care physicians, abortive medication, treating medication, and treatments for long COVID with the ability to risk stratify the buildings that you have to enter and the venues that you have to go into, that's the way out. And we'll get out of it together. Again, I love you guys. Stay safe, be good to each other, and do your best. You just watched Murphy's Medical Minute.